Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all on this webinar from whichever time zone you're joining us. Welcome to A Deeper Blue for Green Bonds, Water Investment Criteria for Nature-Based Solutions. My name is Robin Miller, and I'm a manager at Ceres and the new head of the monthly Investor Water Hub Speaker Series. I'm glad to be joined by three experts who will guide us in a discussion about the newly launched water criteria focused on nature-based solutions for green bonds. Moving in, we have a great slate of speakers for our webinar today. Joining me are Justine Laibel from the Climate Bonds Initiative, Mike Brown from the San Francisco Public Water Utilities Commission, and John Matthews from the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. This webinar is part of the Ceres Investor Water Hub Speaker Series. To give some context, the Investor Water Hub is a working group of the Ceres Investor Network, which provides opportunities for peer-to-peer sharing of leading environmental, social, and governance concerns, water integration, and engagement practices. We have over 90 institutional investors in the hub and recently launched the Investor Water Toolkit, which is the first comprehensive resource for institutional investors to evaluate and act on water risks in investment portfolios. We are guided by an advisory committee of the firms listed on this slide. Through the hub, we present frequent learning opportunities like this webinar as part of our speaker series. If you have an idea for a speaker series or topic, or are interested in learning more about the Investor Water Hub or any one of other Ceres water-related initiatives, including our Connect the Drops campaign in California and Feeding Ourselves Thirsty, please reach out to me directly. I just want to say how delighted Ceres has been working with the Water Consortium members, including the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, CDP, the Stockholm International Water Institute, and the World Resources Institute, and of course, the Climate Bonds Initiative. So at this point, I'm happy to turn the floor over to Justine, Director of Market Development at the Climate Bonds Initiative. Justine works with both private and public sector actors in emerging markets to develop national policy guidelines and roadmaps to enable access to green bond financing. So, Justine, take it away.
Thank you, Robin. Hopefully you can hear me okay.
Yes. Yep, you sound good.
Great. Fantastic. Just wanted to check. So fantastic to be here today, and thank you for inviting me to have a chance to engage with this very important piece of work that CBI and all the consortium members worked very hard on. And it's great to see so familiar names that are joining us today from around the world. So fantastic to be here. So what I'd like to do is, before we dive deep into the specifics around the water criteria, I think it's important for many of you that I'm sure on the call today that would like to sort of get a sense of really what the green bond is, how it has been growing globally, the opportunities it has been presenting, and most importantly, the role that standards are now starting to play in being able to ensure credibility, but also consistency across markets as it develops. What I would like to do, though, for those of you that are just hearing about Climate Bonds Initiative for the first time, is actually who we are. We're a global organization based in London. Our core focus is mobilizing institutional capital to address climate change. That's both on the mitigation and adaptation side. We've been around roughly now for 10 years and been fortunate enough to be heavily involved with many of our key partners and stakeholders around the world in helping to build this market. And so we've evolved into almost a one-stop shop for green bonds, and that comes in the form of outreach that helps to stimulate the markets. That may be through policy, maybe through government engagement, it may be through local market development work with capital market players, et cetera, et cetera. There's also things like our market data and analysis. We are the largest holder of green bond data globally. We provide state-of-the-market reports and further data and analytical type reports for our stakeholders to that end. And then, of course, what we'll be speaking mostly about today, but of course is not the only thing that we're involved in, is the International Climate Bond Standard and Certification Scheme. And this is very much centered around not just understanding what we mean by green and fleshing out the green definitional work across key sectors. But it's also providing that assurance around the green bond product. It's also about working closely with other stakeholders that are looking at developing standards and helping to foster that growth as well, as we're beginning to see the shift towards harmonization on what we mean by green and ensuring the due diligence process is in place. So let's take a snapshot of this phenomenal growth that we've seen since, let's say, 2012, where a few DFIs, World Bank and EIB in particular, had initiated the market with around $3 billion worth of bonds. And as you can see, in a very short period of time, we've gone from $3 billion to what is now over $300 billion outstanding. 2017 was a remarkable year, but of course it was 2014 that was coined as the green bond year, the year of green bonds, and then in that became China, India, LATAM, and so on. So this went very quickly from a U.S.-driven, European-driven market with the help of development finance institutions to very much a global market. We now have over 1,500 green bond issuances, 78 growth upon 2016 year, close to 40 countries from all continents, and as you can see there, a plethora of different issuers. We've got issuers from governments, whether we're talking about national, which is sovereign story has emerged over the course of the last year, to local governments, but also non-financial corporates and corporates alike. So it is quite an amazing development story. And it's important to note why this is actually happening. Green bonds are, like any other bond, they're not asking for anything special. I have to say, from when I'm speaking to people, it's always this thought of, oh, this new innovative product. This is bond financing. The fundamental difference is what it's actually financing, 100% eligible projects and assets that are delivering on an environmental benefit. And, of course, what we've also begun to see is co-benefits that could include social and many other things. It's also around the transparency and disclosure around the use of proceeds, and that's quite critical. And I think that's definitely been the most attractive part of the green bond to investors. So it's very important to highlight that anyone can issue a green bond if they're able to issue bonds and ensuring that they can meet those core fundamentals on transparency and disclosure and the due diligence on the portfolio on being green. So this will give you that global spread of what we've seen in some of the numbers to date, rough estimates, of course. And as you can see, that you've even seen some issuance coming out of Africa, notably Nigeria being one of the first African countries to issue a green sovereign bond. We've also seen LATAM light up quite recently. We've had developments within Peru, Chile, Mexico, Brazil, and whether that be issuance, but also it could simply be about getting the right architecture in place at the local level to begin participating in the market, which has been quite interesting. For China, China really was an overnight supersized story, as it tends to be. We had zero issuance in 2015, of which the People's Bank of China and others came together to put in place the right frameworks and rules of issuance, and within 1 year they went from zero to $40 billion. They are now one of the leading issuers globally in comparison to the other developed nations such as the United States and Europe. So as we begin to sort of move into the standardization discussion, it's very important to note that there were two key instrumental pieces of work that were ensuring that we got off to the right start on best practices. The Green Bond Principles, of which several of the global banks came together to put that in place, Citi, JP Morgan, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, and now has turned into a 60-plus membership of which very straightforward recommendations to issuers that if you want to come to issue a green bond, you must ensure transparency around the use of proceeds, how your projects are being selected, how you're managing, and how you're reporting on those proceeds. So I always say when I'm engaging with issuers, I always say it's a market entry point. If you are not able to meet the green bond principles, then it's time to go back to the drawing board. On the back of that, the International Climate Bond Standard Certification took it and embedded the GBPs into a standardized framework model and looked into the green definitional work across all the major sectors, whether that be energy, transport, agriculture, land use alike, water, and so on, to begin identifying what are the key investment areas that are going to transition us to a climate-compatible world, and ensuring that the right credibility is behind that through a set of criteria to ensure we deliver on the impact. I'm also showing you here some of the other developments that have come out of that since those resources have become available on the international stage for the last 5 to 6 years. We have also seen an interesting development happen at the national level where countries have embedded those into their local context and practices within their capital markets. And so that's something to be watching out for. We've also seen the H-leg process here out of the EU, the High-Level Expert Group on Sustainable Finance, where the European Commission called for the H-leg to come together and develop a EU-wide sustainability taxonomy that builds off of the definitional work to date across the development banks, CBI, and other players. And they're now looking into how they can further advance this into standardization. And then, of course, we've also seen within the verifiers communities more calls for supervision, ensuring that we have the right capacity within our verifiers across globally and also at the local level to be able to provide the assurance required for investors on investing in these products. So, explicitly giving some more detail on the Climate Bond Standard Certification Scheme, think of it like a fair trade-like symbol for the bond market. We want to get to a point at which investors have trust that a due diligence process has been done on both the portfolio and management of use of proceeds end of these bonds, and that the fact that they can make easy, quick decisions on buying. The demand for green bonds is so extremely high that it's very short window of time to buy them, in some cases as little as 2 hours for investors. So they need to be able to have something that they can see, trust, and make quick decisions on. And that's really the intent here, to reduce market friction in the marketplace and to be able to reach scale faster. It's consistent of 2 parts. One is the, I'd say, body of the standard, the parent part of the standard being details around management and reporting processes, the use of proceeds. And then the B section of the standard is explicit to what is in the portfolio, so the sector-specific criteria that details the requirements that the assets must meet to be eligible for certification. And this is just a helicopter view, by no means a full view of what the Climate Bonds taxonomy entails. This is a referencing piece for issuers when they're beginning to consider what they would like to include in their green bonds, what is possible, being able to review their balance sheets. For companies, it's the same, and so looking at across the different sectors, what is possible. And as you will see in the transport space, things like rail, public mass transit systems, these tend to be things that people don't understand are actually green assets, obviously subject to additional criteria to make sure that they are meeting what they are going to say, what they say on the tin they're going to deliver. But as you will see, there is quite a significant amount of different opportunities that we can be looking at, thinking outside the box on what is possible. At the end of the day, we need to be thinking about, how we build out our infrastructure in the decades ahead to be able to meet the challenges we are already facing but also continuing to have efforts on mitigation to climate change. The process for development of the criteria is quite robust, but obviously that comes with a bit of a time constraint. So there is quite a bit of time and effort that is put into the development of the criteria, of which it starts with CBI preparing background research and pulling together technical working group. These technical working groups consist of experts from around the world. We try to bring coverage geographically to encompass all issues. We bring that together in a 6 to 9 month process of regular calls and interaction with the TWG that is going through iteration of proposals on identifying the key investments and subject to what criteria that they can put forward. This then is in parallel to a process with an industry working group. We want to make sure that we engage stakeholders together on this process. And so toing and froing between that comes out to be a proposal, of which that then goes into public consultation. And through that process, as a finalized proposal, we then find ourselves having the board. The board consists of $33 trillion of assets under management that is the governance body to the standards that makes a decision on all standard-related matters. And finally, before turning it over to Robin, the certification process is as follows, quite straightforward. Preparing the bond, so getting the asset, identifying the assets against the taxonomy, and preparing the materials, a green bond framework, which is all guided through the standard framework itself for assistance to the issuer. They then engage a verifier that comes in to check to make sure that everything checks out at the pre-issuance phase of the bond. That means getting the systems in place, preparing the portfolio, the commitment of once funds are allocated, that's how they're going to meet those commitments. This then goes to the board for certification, and at post-issuance, once the funds are being allocated to the projects and assets, the verifier comes in to check to make sure everything has panned out. And then it's just up to the issuer to report annually to the life term of the bond. So if it's a 5-year bond, we would expect to see 5 reports. It's very important to note that this is not a 150-page CSR report. Okay? This is simply stating that the assets still exist or the assets are in development, the proceeds are still being managed accordingly, and we have some assurance behind that. So I will leave it at there before we turn it over for the rest of the presentation, and I'll take questions when we are in conclusion. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you, Justine. That was a terrific overview and a great way to get us leveled up on climate bonds and the importance of these standards in the process. So I do see we have a few questions coming in, and I'll remind folks that we'll have all of our speakers present and then field a few of those questions before we conclude. So now that we have a good context on the history of climate bonds, I'll introduce Mike Brown, the manager of the Environmental Finance Programs at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. Mike represents the Commission on the Climate Bonds Initiative Water Criteria Industry Working Group and has led the issuance of more than $1 billion in CBI certified green bonds for the agency's water, wastewater, and power capital programs. So Mike, take it away.
Thank you, Robin. Good morning. My name is Mike Brown. I'm the Environmental Finance Manager at the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, and I'm very happy to be here today. I'd like to thank Robin and Ceres for organizing this discussion. I plan to take just a few slides to talk about the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, or SFPUC, and our experience with green bonds. The SFPUC is a department of the City of San Francisco and operates 3 separate utilities or enterprises, one for water, wastewater, and power. This slide provides a quick overview of each utility, including bond rating and outstanding debt. As you can see here, each of the utilities are separately rated credits. And I'll just highlight a few points. The SFPUC has more than $5 billion in outstanding debt and has adopted capital plans to issue approximately $8.5 billion additional bonds or debt over the next 10 years. And we hope that the vast majority of that will be issued as CBI certified green bonds. To date, the SFPUC has issued, as Robin mentioned, just over $1 billion in CBI certified green bonds, and that accounts for nearly 20% of our total outstanding indebtedness. I'd like to point out that we've issued both taxable and tax-exempt bonds. About a third of the $1 billion of the green bonds we've issued to date have been sold taxable, and we received a pricing benefit for those taxable bonds, and I'll touch on that on a later slide in just a moment. I'll now take a moment to speak about the wastewater enterprise, which is just in the beginning of embarking on a very large capital program. In addition to the $241 million in green bonds we issued in 2016, which was the first bond issued under the water criteria at that time, another wastewater bond sale is coming up this summer in July. We expect to sell about $400 million in additional green bonds, and again certified under the CBI's water criteria. The bonds sold in 2016 and the bonds we plan to sell this summer are to finance the same capital program, the Sewer System Improvement Program, which we refer to as SSIP. When we issued the bonds in 2016 for the SSIP, working with Sustainalytics and Agua and CBI, we also received programmatic approval to issue green bonds for the remainder of the program, meaning now only minimal additional review is required to issue bonds for the SSIP. This is hugely beneficial for us. It really reduces the time and cost requirements to sell green bonds. So it's definitely accelerating our issuance of green bonds. On this slide, I've highlighted several green infrastructure projects that make up a portion of the SSIP, and these are being reviewed for the new green and hybrid criteria. These include creek daylighting and permeable streetscape projects to address flooding in our city. I'll end with a slide on the pros and cons of issuing green bonds, at least as we've experienced them, plus what we see as an opportunity for tax-exempt muni issuers. First, with some of the pros, and I'll highlight just some of the main ones here, but the expanding investor base, and that's a priority for us. We always invest in marketing when we sell bonds, and with the green bonds, beginning with our first issuance in 2015, we've attracted new green and impact investors that were not buying our bonds before. So that's been great for us, and this is both on the tax-exempt and taxable side. And they've stuck with us through subsequent green bond issuances. And this connects also to the marketing and PR benefits as well as reputational benefits. On this point of being rewarded for already taking climate change into account, what I mean there is that a lot of municipal issuers are already financing projects that are addressing climate change in one way or another, either adaptation or mitigation. And so, in a sense, if your projects that you already have in the pipeline are doing that, you can have those certified. It doesn't require any changes in technology or anything like that. And finally, and this is really probably the most important point, is the potential for a lower cost of borrowing for issuers. And as I mentioned, we received that on the taxable bonds we've issued. We've issued several now. About a third of the $1 billion we've issued has been taxable green bonds. And we experienced a savings of several points relative to non-green taxable bonds. So that's been very exciting for us and definitely encouraging us to continue to issue green bonds. We've not seen the same pricing benefit on the tax-exempt side, however, and we hope this will change. And I'll just take a moment and talk about the difference between the taxable and tax-exempt markets. The tax-exempt market is a small fraction of the overall green bond market. It's just about 10% of the total, and it's really limited to U.S. investors. So we don't really have enough liquidity in the market yet to drive the price lower as we're seeing on the taxable side. But again, we hope that changes soon. Moving to some of the negative aspects of issuing green bonds, the time and expense for certification, and the ongoing reporting requirements. And I'll take those together. Both of those are legitimate concerns. The getting certification does require time and some costs. However, I think that they're manageable. There's nothing too onerous about either one of those requirements, and same with the ongoing reporting. And it's nothing of the magnitude of preparing for a rating agency presentation or preparing our annual disclosure reports, which are required. So I think those are both manageable issues, but they're real. Also, liability. Some issuers, and including our disclosure council, have raised concerns that, what if the green bonds definition changes over time because the market is still new, or what if the use of proceeds changes over time? And I think those, again, are valid concerns, and I think we've been able to address those in our disclosure. So adequately preparing your disclosure should one of those events occur or some unforeseen event occur to change the status of the bonds from green to non-green. We think that can be managed in the disclosure. Finally, I'll talk about some of the opportunities we see with the green bonds. Once there's a pricing benefit, many tax-exempt issuers sitting on the sidelines now will enter the market. And we hope that supply will continue to drive demand. And what we hope to see is that investor demand will continue to drive costs down so that decision makers, when choosing between green and non-green projects that perform equally well, will choose the green project because it can be financed at a lower cost. Climate considerations aside. The opportunity for green bonds then is that they can not only help build projects at a lower cost for issuers, but also prepare their communities to be more resilient to climate change. I'll now hand it over back to Robin. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks especially for helping us see some of the tangible applications of green bond issuance and giving us a preview of some potential projects that could be issued along with this newly updated standard. So to round out the speaker portion of this webinar, I will welcome John Matthews, the lead and co-founder of the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, or AGWA, which is chaired by the World Bank and the Stockholm International Water Institute, SIWI. Since 2003, John has integrated technical and policy approaches for climate resilience over 5 continents and in more than 20 countries. John's areas of focus include decision-making frameworks for adapting water infrastructure and ecosystems, deploying finance instruments like the bond criteria to mainstream adaptation, developing climate-sensitive approaches to environmental flows, and resilient nature-based solutions. So I'm excited for a dynamic presentation, and John, you can go ahead and take the floor.
Thanks so much, Robin. And I just want to acknowledge, scanning the list of participants, I see a lot of familiar names and of colleagues and friends. I'm really glad to see you there. It looks like an extremely diverse group of participants, and I want to make sure that I reflect that in my comments in the talk. And I also want to acknowledge that this is really building on a fantastic presentation that I have really just stolen from Lily Dye at CBI. I prepared another talk, and hers was so much better than mine that I really just put my name above hers. But it's really her talk. And there's a lot of text in this presentation. And I think that's important to keep because after this, I hope that you will download this PowerPoint, these slides, because they're an excellent synthesis of the range of issues that you will need to really consider about your own personal or institutional role and how to think about these bonds. In terms of the big issue that we're trying to tackle here, my own background is really from the environmental NGO community before I started AGWA. And one of my frustrations in thinking about nature-based solutions is that we often had profound mismatches in dialogue. We were really talking from an advocacy perspective rather than really trying to engage in a very practical, kind of audience-centric way with people in the finance community and with people who were technical water managers. And I believe that the criteria that we're talking about today go a long way in trying to connect those communities. And I think that that's quite well recognized in the list of our partners. There's actually a much larger list of groups that are involved here. These are some of the groups, but altogether we had something like 150 people over the last 4 years that have been involved in the development, kind of channeling and synthesis of the criteria that we're talking about today. And the reason for that is that we have really wanted to make sure that we were creating criteria that were credible, that had low transaction costs, and that they were grounded in how we see water resources management in the 21st century. Historically, we have proceeded in two phases. The first phase, beginning in 2014 and released in 2016, focused on traditional gray approaches to infrastructure. So water utilities, energy systems, water storage systems, drought and flood resilience issues, and quite rapidly we began certifying bonds. Mike and I met through that process, and I was really honored to be part of the first scoring team for the initial issuance. And we rapidly went to communities like Cape Town. The second phase, which Justine really led phase one, and then there's a shift where she took a kind of a higher role, and towards phase two, we're thinking about nature-based and hybrid water solutions. And that process completed earlier this year, and we formally launched those criteria just a few weeks ago. So what kinds of assets are we really talking about with the second phase of criteria? We're thinking in most cases about a broad spectrum of areas. We have not included hydropower. That's going to be a follow-up set of criteria. But we have worked on areas such as water storage, the role that ecosystems can play in water storage, including groundwater, thinking about flood defenses, drought defenses, the role that green and hybrid systems can play in treating water quality, including integrating with forest management systems, looking at stormwater, and the central role of ecological restoration and management. But we also think that there are even new kind of emerging opportunities about how we might be able to think about environmental flows from this perspective, how we might be able to integrate in the future with programs like payments for ecosystem services. Some visual examples. Philadelphia recently has undergone an extensive green stormwater system that's very comparable to what Mike showed in his presentation with the first issuance. It's a widespread pattern. You see this happening in Jakarta, in Ho Chi Minh City. You see it everywhere. Aquifer storage is a rapidly emerging new approach to nature-based solutions. It's really been highlighted in a lot of regions with extremely seasonal precipitation, in arid or semi-arid regions. Las Vegas in the U.S., for instance, is a real pioneer in terms of aquifer storage. In places like the Netherlands, they invented this phrase, the room for the river, and it's trying to think about flood defense in a completely different way, making sure that you're seeing ecosystems such as wetlands as an instrument for being able to absorb floodwaters rather than trying to build earthen or artificial material levees and dikes. Now, there are 3 steps for how we think about applying the water criteria. And climate change, of course, is a very diverse area, and typically divided into climate mitigation, which is about greenhouse gases, very different usage of the word mitigation than we see generally in the water community, and climate adaptation, which is how we address current or potential impacts from climate change. And step one is really focused on making sure that we deal with climate mitigation. Here we really want to make sure that there's at least no net increase in greenhouse gases that are associated with a project. We're very flexible in terms of the regulatory and scoring systems. These are often based at a national level, but they're also standards that have been developed by the UNFCCC and other institutions about climate mitigation. That's usually a very straightforward carbon accounting process. And many issuers are already well along in the process of trying to apply climate mitigation. Climate adaptation is a bit newer, and it's also more complex. It's more multifaceted. It's actually where I would say the expertise for my institution, AGWA, really lies. And here you see the biggest gap. I would say in much of the work of the technical working group and industry working group was trying to bring together very diverse types of experts. I'm a conservation biologist by training with a special interest in aquatic ecosystems, but we brought in hydrologists, engineers, economists, civil engineers as well as environmental engineers, finance specialists of a wide variety to make sure that we had come up with a credible application and useful set of criteria for thinking about adaptation and resilience. And here we identified kind of two main components, two qualities that we were aiming for in how we think about climate adaptation and climate resilience. The quality of flexibility and the quality of robustness. Robustness is how thoroughly have you thought about the future, the kinds of scenarios that you might be facing. Is the future going to be wetter, drier, or wetter and drier? Flexibility is how you deal with the uncertainty issues. How much room for maneuver do you have if your attempts for thinking about the future were wrong? And so the way we divided that up in the phase one work was we thought we need to focus on water allocation, which is essentially how water is divided up among stakeholders and users in a particular region, in a basin. So it's thinking above the project scale at a catchment level or at a basin scale, and saying, is that a rigid system? Is it a flexible system? And projects that are in more flexible systems are going to score better. In places like Western Europe or North America that have really strong regulatory frameworks, they generally have very good high-scoring allocation systems. Governance is really about conflict and how you deal with situations in which you want to be able to reduce or avoid conflict, or if conflict happens, then how you negotiate through that process. And making sure that you have a flexible governance system that allows you to update and shift as the hydrological system continues to evolve with climate change. So both of those are really about kind of long-term management and thinking processes, and what happens when things are maybe different than what we thought that they were going to be. Technical diagnostics, this is really what often comes out and is already done in 90% plus of the project development criteria internally in most issuers. So this is the technical team, the engineering team, hydrology team, that they're thinking about how do we model the system, how do we build on it, understand how it functions and works, and try to make sure that we have made a credible approach to really thinking about robustness. And those are some of the geekiest questions I'd like to say. The new bit that we really added over the last 2 years was thinking about nature-based solutions. Here we try to expand on some of the qualities that were thought about in terms of flexibility and robustness, and what are some of the special issues that we need to think about with ecosystems, either existing or constructed. And lastly if in the vulnerability assessment, because effectively sections 1 through 4 are climate vulnerability assessment. In the vulnerability assessment, if there are climate risks that have been identified, then we need to also see what you're going to do about them. Have you been able to develop an adaptation plan that's effective and useful and directly responds to those potential risks? Why mitigation? Mitigation is important for lots of reasons, but there are special issues that relate to water. Water is often intensely related to climate mitigation issues, and again, excluding hydropower, we often see a lot of development, such as GIZ in Germany, with working around water efficiency programs, thinking about energy, heat capture, and so on. So there are a lot of really good mitigation projects that are coming out related to water issuance. The adaptation and resilience aspect, one of the key items here is the longevity of the project. And what we really emphasize here is we want to make sure the climate is really relevant. So you might actually not have to score the adaptation resilience component if the operational lifespan of the project is less than 20 years. That's a standard that was developed by the World Bank for their own projects in 2015. And the core of this work assumes that you have a climate vulnerability assessment. If you're a finance person in your institution, what I would do is I would go down the hall and I would talk to your planning or engineering department, your technical team. They will say, I know exactly what that is. We think about climate risk all the time. We're already doing that work. What we just need to do now is make sure that our investors understand why that's important and that we've done the due diligence already. The eligibility process has really already been addressed by Justine. If you're doing a gray project, a traditional project, then you really just need to do sections 1, 2, and 3, and if climate risk has been identified, then section 5 as well. If you want to get the green and hybrid component in there, then you also need to complete section 4. So it's optional, but it goes into a little bit of additional detail, most of which should seem pretty familiar. And very cleverly, for the nature-based criteria, I circled the 2 key words. One of them is the wrong word that I circled. You need to meet 2 foundational qualities for thinking about a nature-based solution in order to proceed with those criteria. This was one of the most important and actually contentious aspects of the technical working group for these criteria. The first was to make sure that we're thinking about the intentional use of natural or nature-based features, processes, and functions. So you need to make sure that you want to use this ecosystem formally within a larger water resources management program, that you're thinking of it not just as an ecosystem, but also as a piece of infrastructure. The second, this is where the circle is around the wrong word. So the P word, it's the next one, prioritizes. That we are prioritizing existing natural features or nature-based features. And what we want to make sure what the technical working group was really concerned about was avoiding greenwashing, that we were really focusing on, if we can, to focus on what's on the landscape already. If it's been damaged, that we then prioritize restoration. If we're talking about a brownfield site, that we think about how to make sure that we're recreating something that's credible, that actually is truly ecological in its scope and impact. I've talked a little bit already about allocation, governance, technical diagnostics. These are some example questions from those criteria. Many of you are probably most interested in nature-based components. So the sections within, subsections within section 4 focus really on how much do we know about that system. And a system that we know more about, that we have a deeper understanding of, is going to score better than one in which we have maybe a more facile or low data awareness of. So looking at the site inventory, ecological baselines for management, do we have good data inventories? What's happening beyond that project site, upstream, downstream, in the aquifer, and do we have meaningful monitoring and management systems to help us deal with uncertainty and efficacy over time. These are aspects that really should be a part of an environmental impact statement anyway. But we want to make sure that the people that are doing the good work are really rewarded for it by investors. The adaptation plan, it's a term of art from the climate change community, and it's what follows climate vulnerability or climate risk assessment. It says basically we have identified a risk and we're going to do something to address that risk. Even if there's some uncertainty associated with it, we're going to come up with a plan in the future. So these are typical kinds of questions that are part of the adaptation plan criteria. Scoring. This is a checklist. This is something that came very much out of the industry working group. Yes, no, there are, or not applicable. There are some cases in which a question may not be applicable. We decided that we needed to have, for each section, at least 60% passing. So far, all of the issuances to date have been high passes. And we need to have a pass in every section that's relevant. And this goes to the remainder of the process that Justine described in terms of certification. How do you want to learn more? Well, the interest has been very global, reflecting the technical working group itself. We often had conference calls that would span 8 or 10 time zones. I was involved in a lot of 2 a.m. phone calls. So we have strong interest in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, and there's a lot of information that you can learn about in more detail. So there's a new Security Beat blog. If you don't know that blog, it's fantastic. We wrote an article about applying these criteria in Asia and China earlier this year. We did a great podcast that comes out of AGWA. You can find in all the major podcast criteria with a great interview with the lead for the Phase 2 work, Anna Creed at CBI. And it's a really meaningful, very interesting, wide-ranging discussion that we had with her there. And UNESCO publishes a quarterly journal called Courier. And they actually reached out to us. They were so excited in the World Water Development Report about a box on these new criteria. They asked us to write a longer substantive piece for their work. So that's also a really nice piece that came out, I believe, in January. So thank you very much. I hand it back over to Robin.
Hi, John. Thank you very much for that excellent, concise, but yet very detailed presentation, so we really appreciate it. Unfortunately, Robin's having trouble with her line, so I'm going to run the question section, and we have a number of questions that have come in. I did want to let folks know our speakers have very generously suggested that if we don't get to your questions through Ceres, we will try to email you answers that we do not cover. So thank you for your interest. I think, so let's start things off. One of the questions, how can this standard potentially affect or influence municipal bond ratings? Do folks have opinions on that? Mike, is that maybe a good question for you?
Yeah, I'll say that increasingly rating agencies are making climate a criteria that they're asking questions about and including in their assessments. They also have separate green bond rating services, but even apart from that, both Moody's and S&P, who we work with regularly on water and wastewater, and Fitch for power, they all are asking more and more about climate issues. So for us, it would be, for our water enterprise, it's supply considerations, it's storage. For our wastewater enterprise, it would be sea level rise issues and storm intensity, things like that, flooding. So they are getting into that more and more. So I think it all sort of strengthens your story, but it's not. There's no direct link at this time. I think where it really probably helps is if you're an infrequent issuer, a small issuer, having your bond certified as green gives investors and perhaps rating agencies as well a little bit more confidence that the projects will do what they are intended, things like that.
Thank you, Mike. A follow-on question to you, Mike, is also, is the SSIP being implemented to, what is driving the work? Is it being implemented to mitigate combined sewer systems overflows or sanitary sewer system overflows as a result of some kind of enforcement or consent order? Can you give a bit more details on, what is behind that work?
It's a 80 project plus program. It's going to span 2 decades and cost about $8 billion. So it's an overhaul in a sense of our wastewater system, some of which date back to the middle 1800s. We have brick pipes and wooden pipes going back, or brick pipes anyway, going back to the mid 1800s. So we have a lot of aging infrastructure that needs to be replaced. We have our main wastewater treatment plant was built in the 50s, and it's reached the end of its useful life. That's the main driver in this initial phase. That's about a $1.3 billion project of the $3 billion first phase that where we received our programmatic green bond approval. And it is to address flooding. Flooding is definitely a big issue here, and combined sewer overflows as well. We have a combined system, which is fairly unusual for the West Coast. Our stormwater and our sanitary flows are combined into one system, and all are treated. Nothing is sent directly into the bay or ocean. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Very helpful, and so interesting how comprehensive the work is underway. A question for you, John. Is the Sponge City construction in China one of the nature-based? Would that be one of the nature-based type solutions that the criteria is looking at? And maybe if you could explain also, what the Sponge City concept means.
Sure, that's a great question. Sponge cities are an idea that, to my knowledge, they developed maybe 5 or 6 years ago. As often happens in China with new ideas, they came up with a really poetic term. I love the idea of a sponge city. In many parts of China, flooding is a big issue. It's become an increasingly important issue with rapid urbanization across the country, even in areas that have been historically pretty dry. And a major shift in orientation is, instead of pushing the water downstream someplace, is to say, actually, maybe what we need to do is make use of the space that we have to have the city itself absorb that water somehow. And there's been a lot of innovation in China around the sponge city concept. And there are a lot of claims that are also made in terms of the climate adaptation benefits that may be associated with the sponge city concept. So the easy answer is that it depends, but in general, it's probably yes. The reason that the answer depends is that some of the sponge city solutions are not necessarily nature-based solutions, that there may not be an ecosystem component. But my own sense, the ADB, for instance, is conducting right now quite a comprehensive, the Asian Development Bank is conducting a quite comprehensive study of sponge cities in China, and how they can be more systematically addressed is to think about a kind of spectrum of aspects of that sponge. So you may think of some concrete sponges, and you may think of some wetland sponges that may be present in a particular city. So my guess is that an issuance that would come out of a Chinese city, or frankly any other city that's using a similar type of approach to stormwater concerns, is that there will be a spectrum within that single issuance. There'll be some gray components, some hybrid components, and some kind of bright green ecosystem components. So you certainly are going to be using the phase 1 components, almost certainly, but you hopefully will also be using some of the nature-based solutions too.
Thank you, John. So maybe we have time for one more question, and again, we'll certainly try to answer the other questions via email for those that we did not cover, and we'll certainly be sending a recording around to share as well. But I did want to mention or add in, there was a question about, how do we get more local authorities, municipalities considering, using green bonds or climate bonds and criteria. I just want to partly answer the question. I know there is an initiative underway called the Green Bonds Pledge, and this is an initiative that Ceres is involved with, along with CBI, CDP, and the California Governor's Office, and many, many more, really trying to promote issuance, especially by municipalities. But we'll turn it to Justine to see if she has further ideas for how to answer this question.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thanks, Monica, for bringing that forward, because that's true. That is in lead up to the Global Climate Action Summit in September that Governor Brown is hosting. We're expecting people from all over the world to be attending this, and the Green Bond Pledge has been made central to that event. And it's simply about folks like existing issuers like Mike with SFPUC, MTA, Metropolitan Transport Authority in New York, across the board, local issuers, local governments, munis, state level, and even for corporations. It's basically signaling to the market their understanding and awareness that we need to start shifting capital to the right infrastructure going forward, and green bond serves as one of those useful tools to access that capital flow to do so. I'd say that we can't underestimate the need for market education and outreach, of which many of our institutions that are with you today are in active participation and driving forward, which is making sure that it's understood what the difference is between these two products. Most importantly, making it accessible and easy to do. Mike referring to the transaction costs, but I think that as we are moving forward in this market, it's extremely lower cost than it was when it started just as little as 5-6 years ago. And so we need to be able to get the messages out, be very clear about the process, and also educate around what's possible. There's still a need for an understanding of what we mean by green, and making sure that we have ourselves measuring the performance of these assets, not only for asset management purposes, which is a lot of what you've heard about today, simply about how you managing those assets going forward in light of hidden risks that we haven't been so up to speed on managing, but also on being able to report back to investors, to become more closely involved with the investor base, and being able to provide the information required on these things. So long-winded answer, but I'd say that market education is key, outreach is key, and of course getting involved in initiatives like the Green Bond Pledge and other things that are happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Justine. And I'm afraid our time is up, but thank you very much, everyone, for your interest. I really want to thank our excellent speakers, John Matthews, Justine Laibel, Mike Brown, not only for speaking, but all their hard work in this area, and also my colleague, Robin Miller. Again, a recording will be sent. For more information also, please do look at the website climatebonds.net and the Standard on Water. There's a lot of information there, and feel free to reach out to any of us if you have further questions. Thank you again.